Welcome to Southern Fried Asian. I am your host, Keith Chow. On today's show, we're going to be speaking with New York Times-bestselling author Jenny Han. She's the writer of books such as To All the Boys I've Loved Before and The Summer I Turned Pretty, including each franchise's subsequent sequels. This August on Netflix, To All the Boys I've Loved Before will be adapted into a major motion picture starring Lana Condor of X-Men Apocalypse. In fact, Simon & Schuster just released a movie exclusive cover of To All the Boys Loved Before, so check that out. Jenny is a native of Virginia like myself, so we're going to kick it off by spending a few minutes talking about our home state, but hope you enjoy my conversation with Jenny Han. Joining us on the line now is the New York Times bestselling author of several books, including the To All the Boys I Love series, which is becoming a movie on Netflix this summer starring X-Men Apocalypse's Lana Condor. Please welcome to Southern Fried Asian, Jenny Han.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You grew up in Virginia, so it's always great to have a fellow Virginian on the podcast.
Thank you. Proud Virginian.
What part of Virginia are you from?
I'm from Richmond.
Born and raised?
Yes. And you?
I was born in Luray, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, Page County, Luray Caverns. I'm sure you've heard.
Sure.
Who hasn't heard of Luray Caverns? Come on.
Yeah, you always bring every Asian relative to the Luray Caverns. I've been there many times.
Awesome. We might have passed as ships in the night.
Yeah, and my old friend lived in Harrisonburg.
Yes.
So
my brother was born in Harrisonburg. Harrisonburg is, when you live in Luray, Harrisonburg is about a half an hour, 45 minutes away. When you live in Luray, that's where you do everything, right? Because there's nothing to do in Luray other than go to a cavern. But you go to Harrisonburg to go to the mall, to go to the movies, stuff like that. It's where I saw Return of the Jedi. I still have very clear memories of seeing Return of the Jedi because my dad got a parking ticket because he didn't know the movie was going to be more than 2 hours.
Oh, you know what? Actually, Harrisonburg is where I saw T2.
Exactly. So you did spend a lot of time in Harrisonburg.
Kind of, yeah. We had old family friends who lived there, so we would go in the summers.
Harrisonburg's great. I mean, I haven't been back in many decades, and I wonder. I've heard if I go back to Harrisonburg now, I wouldn't recognize any of it, which is probably true. But I did spend many nights and many days at the Valley Mall.
Oh yeah. I remember that.
But then from there, I went to the Hampton Roads area. So I lived in Chesapeake. I went to school at ODU. I actually spent a lot of time in Richmond in college because I was in a band, and 3/4 of our band was in Richmond. So I spent a lot of time driving back and forth.
Oh, what was your band called?
Oh, we're going to go into that? I'm supposed to be asking you questions. Why is this turning into let's learn about Keith? So let's see. Our band, we had a lot of names. We were called Like Minds, which was stupid.
Like highbrow.
And then we changed our name to Mana, as in food from heaven.
Oh.
But
wait,
we
Christian band or no?
No, not at all. Not at all. We were totally a mid to late 90s kind of emo Sunny Day Real Estate type band.
Got it.
Yeah, that was totally my vibe in the mid 90s. But I spent a lot of time in Richmond. Let's get to you, Jenny, because we're not here. No one gives a shit about me. But I did spend a lot of time in Richmond. Let me ask you about what parts of Richmond did you live? Did you live in the county? Did you live in Henrico County, or were you growing up in the Fan?
No, and you know what? People from my hometown would give me. Wait, can I say any cuss words?
You can totally curse.
They would give me shit for saying Richmond, but I just say Richmond because I feel like people don't know where I'm actually from, which is the South Side, Chesterfield.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
You know what I mean? People don't know that, so I just say Richmond to make it easier.
Exactly.
But I grew up in the South Side.
It's I say Virginia Beach because no one knows where Chesapeake is. You know what I mean? Or Hampton Roads.
Actually,
no one knows what that's
Chesapeake.
called.
That's another spot on the tour from when my Korean relatives would come. We would take them to Chesapeake.
Wow.
As well.
We must have hung out and just not knew about it.
I think so.
Why Chesapeake? Why would you ever bring your Korean relatives to Chesapeake?
To the bay, and then we get shrimp or crab,
okay.
and then like show the water and then you just go right back home.
Right.
There wasn't that much.
Well, here's again, we're going to talk a little bit about where I grew up. So Chesapeake had nothing to do with the Chesapeake Bay, parts of it, I guess. And it's a giant suburb, basically, right? And which is kind of what Chesterfield is, right? It's like the suburb, in a way, of Richmond, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's kind of depressing because I go home and a lot of it that was thriving when I was a teenager is sort of like just shut down. I think the West End, which is like the west side of the suburbs, I guess, is a lot more built up, and the South Side is a little more sleepy, I guess. And
so, like, growing up in Chesterfield, what was it like being Korean American in that part of Richmond? Because again, I'm not too familiar with Chesterfield. I know, like, I spent a lot of time in, my friend lived in the Fan, right, like right by VCU. We spent a lot of time in Carytown.
Did you go to get the wings with the mambo sauce?
Oh yeah, and there was this really
like the place, the eatery.
There was this really cool record shop.
Oh yeah.
In Cary, on Cary Street. I think it was like downstairs. I forget what it was called. But that's so. For those of you who have like no idea what we're talking about, Richmond has VCU, of course, is probably the main university there. Although my cousin went to University of Richmond, so he'd be like, but that's where all like the white people went. And
fancy.
The fancy people, right? The white people and the fancy people, and the fancy Asians went there. But VCU, Virginia Commonwealth, a lot of people probably, if you follow basketball, may have heard of VCU. That was like the hipster, like artsy kind of school, and that was right in the middle of the city.
Yes, and actually, even though I lived on the South Side, I went to high school in Richmond, sort of near the Fan. It was governor's school, so it was at Thomas Jefferson. It was kind of in the middle of downtown.
So what was it like for you being Korean American living in, and I'm assuming Chesterfield is a little bit less mixed.
Yeah, it's weird because I think there's so many Korean people in Northern Virginia. Even back then, there were so many people like in the DC, Maryland area, but there's not as many in Richmond. But I had a lot of Korean American friends because of the church.
Right.
And so, so I knew all my friends from church, but like at my regular school life, I was like the only Korean person or Asian person. I was like the only Asian person in middle school, which is partly why I ended up kind of leaving that area to go to high school downtown, just because it was in 8th grade. I got a lot of like bullying for being Asian, and I was like kind of bad at math, but I was
doing your best to upend stereotypes. Right?
I know, right? I was honors everything else, but my math wasn't great. So then it messed up the whole schedule. So then I was in my gym and my lunch with kids that I didn't know from my other classes. And so I ended up getting bullied a lot in those classes.
Well, this is like the origin story of like fellow Asian American English majors, right? Because we couldn't do the math, so we had to gravitate towards the things we knew how to do. But that experience for you, like being the only Asian, when did you first come to realize that you were like Asian American? Because that's something I talk about a lot in this podcast. That growing up in school, I mentioned college, like it wasn't literally until college that I even thought of the term Asian American, right? Since you didn't grow up among a lot of Asians in school necessarily, at least you had a Korean community that you went to church with. Did it take you a while to come to terms with being Asian American?
No, I don't think so, because, some of my earliest memories are of being at my aunt's kitchen table and her telling me and my cousins, like, what to say when someone makes fun of you for being Asian. Things like that, being very young and hearing that stuff. And then it definitely did happen, but then I think I had my church life, so I saw so many other kids on the weekends, and I also went to Korean school every Saturday. So it was kind of like the dual lives, I guess, of the weekday and then the weekend. And then I think things didn't really change, though, until I went to 5th grade, because my family moved neighborhoods, and it was only about like 20 minutes away, but it was like a fancier neighborhood.
Right.
And I definitely remember being one of the only Asian families in that neighborhood and getting a lot of like abuse. Just like my dad had to take our numbers out of the phone book. People would call our house and say stuff. Yeah. And it was different because it's amazing to me how there's such a world of difference between just a few years, because so I went in when I was 10 and I was going mid-year to a new school, and that was hard. But then my sister was 4 years behind me in school. And because they were younger, I think they just kind of were used to it. You know what I mean? It was like an easier transition for her. And then she was immediately like accepted and had no issues with being teased or anything in middle school. But for me, it was a hard middle school experience. And so then when I went to governor's school, which was like a magnet program, so it was a bunch of nerds, it was so diverse.
Yeah.
Like I hadn't been around, like all the kids I knew from church were going to governor's school, but then also so many other different kinds of kids. I met, like, for the first time, I was meeting kids who were Muslim, kids who were Sikh, Hindu, Jewish. There weren't even Jewish kids really at my regular school. I didn't even get to go to a bar mitzvah. So I missed out on all that cool stuff. And then when I went to governor's school, it was like a world kind of opened up, and I was just like soaking up all this stuff. And you felt very proud to be different at my high school. Like I remember when No Doubt came out and everyone was wearing like the bindis and stuff, and all the Indian girls, the Indian girls were like showing everybody how to wear them and what they meant. And there'd be like an Asian assembly every spring.
Oh, that's
where
cool.
everyone would show out and like bring foods and have like a fashion show and like have like K-pop and all that stuff.
Wow,
and
K-pop even back in the 90s.
even back then,
You're like,
yeah. And it was in the sort of early 90s, mid to early 90s.
But that's really interesting too, because I'm assuming then that the school that you went to beforehand, or the neighborhood you grew up in, was predominantly white.
Yes.
That experience, though, like that kind of duality between being Asian and Korean American and being Southern, what was that like for you in terms of like, it was great that you had exposure to all this diversity, but did you also feel, a lot of times people who grew up in the South kind of internalize a lot of that bullying and internalize a lot of that racism. Did that affect you too? And did that kind of manifest itself in your writing or in your like work as you were starting to discover your voice as a writer in high school and college?
I don't know. I think I've always felt pride about where I came from, Richmond specifically.
Right.
I think, I don't know, because so much of that culture is like American culture to me, and learning from my neighbors, my white neighbors, like about foods and like traditions and, calling adults like ma'am or sir, things like that, that I don't know, it felt like a part of my identity also, I guess. And actually my first book that I wrote, and I started writing it in college, is called Shug, and it's about a girl in a small southern town. And I think when people read that book, they would say it seemed really different than my experience. But actually, there's so much of me in that book. It might be my most personal book, because even though the main character is white, her mom has a problem with alcoholism. And so she's 12, but she has to sort of be the grown-up in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, just as a kid of immigrants who English was their second language, I had to also step up in ways that my peers didn't have to do, where you feel a lot more like weight and responsibility. And that experience is really deeply in that book.
Yeah, Shug is, to be completely transparent, is probably the one book that I know the most from you. Yeah, it's weird, right? Like,
that's weird.
It's because it's a children's book as well. But I remember,
but nobody even knows I wrote it because it's probably like the least successful.
Well, it's funny because I remember finding it in I forget. It's like not Books A Million, but anyway, it's not a Barnes and Noble. But anyway, I found it in the children's. First of all, I have a daughter, so that probably.
Oh, how old is she?
She's 10 now, but she wasn't at the time when I picked up the book. But I remember looking for books for my daughter, and I saw that it was written by you. I know at the time I knew you had written all of these. Like, I think by that point the first of the To All the Boys books had been out, and of course the summer books had been out. So I knew of you from that genre. But then I saw you were book in the children's section, so I thought, huh. And I remembered seeing like a white girl on the cover, and I was curious because it was about growing up in the South, and I think I already knew by that point that you grew up in Virginia, and thinking that, like, I wonder if people who read this book know how much it's authentic to growing up in Virginia. Do you know what I mean? And like, because I think like a lot of times when you, as an Asian American writer, right, you're kind of expected to cover certain themes and cover certain tropes of being Asian, like you said, the immigrant experience, right? Mm-hmm. But I feel like, I don't know, I just felt like it was really interesting to have that dichotomy of a book about being Southern. And when I was curious if like the characters themselves had to be white necessarily, And that's I guess that's where I was getting at with the initial question, that like in your writing, when you write characters that aren't Asian American, do you feel like that helps you kind of be able to tap into that and not necessarily always have to write your specific, or feel like boxed in to write about a very specific type of person?
Well, I think that for me, for that book, it was a really specific, intentional decision to write it that way. And I think in part because I didn't want to have to do a book about the South that was about the pain of
Right.
you know, not fitting in, or your parents don't speak English, all that stuff. I just kind of didn't want to write that story. And also I didn't want to feel hemmed in to only be able to write one kind of story. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think that now publishing and the pop culture at large has shifted a bit.
Yeah.
But, this book came out in 2006. I sold it, I think, 2004. And it was a really different landscape back then. And I don't know. I think I would probably still make the same decision today, but I don't know. I couldn't say that for sure. But the best friend in the book is Korean American.
Right.
I definitely have a lot of moments in the book where the main character is sort of ignorant about her experience and doesn't really get it. So it was like, to me, that was the lens through which I wanted to tell that story, because I think the other story is a way more kind of like gutting story to have to write, and maybe not necessarily one that I wanted to like mine at that moment. Because also I'd started writing it when I was in college. So I was like probably 20 years old as I started that book. And that's not that far out of teens and that whole experience.
And I guess what I meant, that like, do the characters have to be white too? That does the experience of being a person of color in the South necessarily have to be painful? I know that like you were saying that there was a lot of bullying for you as well, but I wonder too, is that like you can have an experience where like you just drink Coke on the porch and that's...
You definitely could. And I think because the first book tends to be, for most writers, I think the most personal book. Yeah. So I don't know, maybe that was just a way for me to be able to write that experience without having to basically turn my insides out and give so much of myself in such a visible way, where then I would be talking nonstop as I'm promoting the book about, being bullied or whatever it is, And sometimes too, is an exhaustion with having to pull out your insides and share your pain with the world as an artist. Maybe you don't want to always tell that kind of story. Maybe you want to show other facets.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was getting at too, because like as a Southern Asian American, right? Like sometimes I feel like I would actually identify more with like a book like Shug than, let's say, Eat a Bowl of Tea or something, which is a classic Louis Chu novel. But I don't really have that, Chinatown in the San Francisco kind of like experience, right? Or even like the Joy Luck Club, like to me is a foreign concept, this idea of like aunties, for me, right? Aunties competing with one another over their children's academic and extracurricular, exploits is not an experience I had growing up. Because first of all, I didn't have aunties. Like all my aunts were white growing up in Virginia, because I had like, my mom had 5 brothers and like 1 sister, right? Like, so most of my uncles, I grew up around uncles and they all married white women. All my aunts were white. It was like, I didn't, you know what I'm saying? Like it was just this different experience, and that leading into like the Southern side, right? And knowing that that's an actual experience is something that I actually identify with more sometimes.
I think that's the point, is that we're not a monolith.
Right.
People have different experiences, and I think I'm still kind of unpacking what that was. Mm-hmm. And when I wrote that first book, like I said, it was not that much distance from that experience too. So I don't know, maybe I'll feel differently about it in 10 more years. Who knows?
Right. Well, that's the thing about being a writer and gaining all of these different life experiences to pull from and to draw from in your work. One question I did want to ask is that, was it intentional that you wanted your first book to be a book for children, and that most of your oeuvre is in the young adult kind of teen fiction? Like, is that a space that you intentionally wanted to write about? Or
yes, that was also very intentional. I think I guess we're close to the same age. You might be a little bit older than me, but like I grew up sort of in what felt like a bit of a renaissance of teen books, which was, there was a lot of like Christopher Pike and like I loved Sweet Valley High and Lois Duncan and a lot of stuff was out there. Now, I don't know if it was all being published at that moment. I would go into the the B. Daltons or the Walden books or whatever.
Yeah, I remember those. So yeah, we're
Yeah.
definitely in the same range.
And I would just gobble up whatever was being put out. And so I have always loved books written specifically for teenagers and young people. And like I said, I was young when I started writing that first one, but that was always what my dream was to write for young people.
What was the inspiration for the Lara Jean character in the To All the Boys series?
The inspiration, I don't know. I think I definitely have a lot in common with that character, but I think the story as a whole, I thought a lot about Little Women and the ways that sisters and families come together and take care of each other when there are people sort of missing from that. In the book, her mom has passed away a few years prior to the story beginning, and so much of it is about how they take care of each other and how they are this unit. And so I think that was in part the inspiration, and also the letter writing and stuff, though, that was taken from my real life. In the book, she writes love letters to boys when she's trying to find closure, and that was something that I used to do.
But they didn't get sent out when you were...
No.
Is Lara Jean the first Asian American protagonist that you wrote?
No, she's not. So I also wrote a book for little kids called Claire Lee and the Apple Pie.
Oh, right.
And that's an illustrated chapter book. So I guess that was the first one. Is that right? Yes, that's the first. Well, no, I actually also wrote a protagonist for a series called Burn for Burn that I co-wrote with my friend Siobhan Vivian. And one of the main characters was also Korean American.
But in terms of, like, I guess your solo, like, in the Summer trilogy has a Caucasian protagonist.
Yes.
And then your first book had a Caucasian protagonist. But in terms of, like, your solo career, I guess.
So teen book, yes.
For teens. How did you come to that decision, after having written, a very successful series around Caucasian characters, to say, I want to actually dive into writing about that not monolithic Asian American experience?
Well, I had the idea first about the letters. And honestly, I thought that the idea had enough of like effervescence to it, enough kind of pop, that I could make her be the main character and still think that my audience would follow me to check the series out. Because I think that there is a thing that happens where you go to a bookstore and you see a cover and it has a person of color on it. You automatically, I think people kind of think that they're going to have to do a lot of mental labor to read that story. I think they think it's going to be a sad story or, something heavier than something they might be in the mood for at the beach or, on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Maybe they don't want to read about, I don't know, like
slavery.
The genocide or slavery or anything. You know what I mean? But I think it's...
And when you say people, do you mean like non-POC people?
No,
or do you mean
I think
all
in
people?
general. I think all people, honestly. I think that there's something that we've been conditioned to in a weird way that how should I put it? Like the standard experience or just like the everyday experience is white. That's like the sort of default in a way. So if you see that on a cover, you're not necessarily thinking it's going to be like a tough read, the way that I think a lot of times, and it's not just that assumption because of the covers. I think a lot of the stuff that ends up being published is that way too. That
That's the default whiteness is in editors and publishers kind of issue.
Well, no, I mean that a lot of the stuff written by POCs in the past was less about just, everyday life and joy. Just like falling in love. It was more like, here's somebody falling in love during the Civil War. You know what I mean? Or like, here's somebody falling in love during, I don't know,
an internment camp or something.
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
exactly. It was kind of centered around that pain of the experience and less around like, here is a love story and it's not about that part of the identity. Even though it's a part of the identity, it doesn't make up the whole story.
Well, that kind of reminds me of a lot of the current discourse in some circles around Crazy Rich Asians, right? Which is a book by Kevin Kwan, who like you talked about, like a beach read with a person of color on the cover, right? Like, and even the title, you don't buy that book and think this is going to be a serious kind of like painful thing, right? It's supposed to be this kind of trashy novel that's a fun beach read, but a lot of the discourse when the trailer came out a couple weeks ago was about like this movie endorses capitalism, and why are we celebrating all that, all this kind of like it wasn't allowed to just be a trashy thing. You know what I'm saying? Like I feel like there's a unnecessary burden on people of color to always be heavy. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, I think that when there's so few stories being told, then so much weight is put on the one story that it has to tell everybody's stories. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I first started out having a conversation with Linda Sue Park, who was sort of the only other Korean American kids book author at the time, and she had written a book called A Single Shard, and she had won a Newbery Award for that. Mm-hmm. And she told me that so many kids would write to her and ask them to tell their stories as well, that were like, a Vietnamese story or stories that were more about immigrant experience of being second generation Asian American. And she would say, it's hard because I can't tell all of those stories, and they're not all her stories to tell, but because it's not really her experience. I think her family came over like first wave or something. So they had been here a lot longer than my parents or people who came over in the second wave. But it's a lot of responsibility kind of put upon you as one of the few voices to be able to tell like all the stories instead of just maybe the story that you want to tell.
And I think going back to All the Boys, it's almost like, it's this great series. It's a coming of age, falling in love, all that stuff. And it's set in like modern contemporary times, and it doesn't have to be like, why aren't you tackling like the inherent racism of blah blah? You know what I mean? Like, not every POC story has to be about that.
Yeah, and I think if you are a POC reading that book, I think you'll pick up a lot of things as well that may not be obvious on the page. Right. But there's a lot. Like, I think the main character, Lara Jean, has a relationship with this boy Peter Kavinsky, who is like really handsome, and in so many ways he has so much privilege. And I think that is where he expects things to just kind of work out. And that's just a part of his character. You know what I mean? And it's one of the kind of obstacles that they face along the way. That's not explicitly being like, oh, this is because of his white privilege, but it's a part of like, the DNA of his character. He doesn't really notice certain things, And
it's almost like, the point that you were making, that you want to just let your characters be characters and not necessarily have to, always constantly signify their race, right? By placing it in a historical context, or, the danger of that, I guess, is that when the Hollywood comes calling and they say, ooh, we want to adapt that, do the characters have to be Asian? Like that if you don't explicitly make, or sometimes when you do explicitly make characters Asian, which we've seen, Hollywood still finds a way to whitewash them. And you were very vocal during the whole whitewashed out campaign that we did back in 2016. What was your experience like in terms of people approaching you and trying to tell you these POC characters don't have to be POC, do they?
Well, there was interest in this being made kind of like right from the very beginning, but that was a non-starter for me, like not having her be Asian American. That was something that I was like really firm on from the start. And so I would have conversations with producers who were interested, and then we talk about casting, and then I don't think they were fully understanding why that was important to me.
Right.
So that did come up like a number of times. And so the book came out in 2014, so and now here we are, it's coming out in 2018. And in the world of like book to adaptation, that's like not a very long time. But also, I think, why shouldn't this book be a movie? Right. I think that the concept was there. I think that it could have been, do I think it would have been an easier process if the lead had been white? Sure. Yes, because then you can cast it with the stable of people who get parts in Hollywood, And something that I've said for a while now is, if you look at the people who are the leads in movies now who are in their 20s, like your Emma Watsons, Shailene Woodley, Kristen Stewart, Jennifer Lawrence, all of them were at the helm of some big young adult franchise, And so back then it didn't matter who got the part of Hermione. It was going to be, it was a star-making role.
Right.
And the same thing with the part of Katniss. It was a star-making role. And so already you're going to have a huge audience built into that who are going to come see that movie opening weekend. But then you're proving yourself as somebody who can get the butts in the seats, right?
Right.
And then from there, then you can be trusted to be someone who opens movies. And then you get to have this really amazing career. And if those characters are never people of color, then you aren't going to get the opportunity to go on and have that great big career, right? It's like...
It's the circular logic, right, that Hollywood employs in all the time.
Yes, because they're like, oh, we need somebody, a name, we need somebody who can greenlight it. But it wasn't like Jennifer Lawrence was greenlighting stuff when she did The Hunger Games. It was after she did that, then it was like everything blows up and she's doing a million huge movies.
And there are certain actors that they give, like, you know, multiple chances at, right? Like, we're doing this interview as Deadpool's about to open, and Ryan Reynolds is this huge star, but he was given, like, 25 different starring roles to land that one, like, huge movie. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is not even his first go-around as a superhero.
Exactly.
But you know, John Cho hasn't gotten that many opportunities to be a superhero at all. You know, like, there are actors and actresses who have not had the same opportunities as other actors.
Yeah, and it becomes a narrative that turns true in a way, you know, where you're like, oh, this person just can't, or this group of people just can't get people into the theaters, you know, and so then you don't put them in anything, and then they don't get that opportunity. And I think writing books for young people and then having young casts, to me, the logic doesn't really bear out, because no young person is going to be able to be that greenlightable person. You know, even the biggest ones that you can think of that are white still aren't someone that you go, oh, they're definitely going to have a $20 million opening weekend. You know what I mean? It just doesn't, like, I don't know that even if it even exists anymore in the way that it used to, but certainly not with young adult. You're not going to have Tom Cruise be the lead of your movie.
Although he'll try, I'm sure.
or Julia Roberts or anyone like that. It doesn't.
Well, and we don't even live in a star-driven industry anymore. It's definitely, like, property and franchise-driven. So, like, you know, you think about, we talked about superheroes, but even the young adult books that you're talking about, the thing that's getting people in the seats is the franchise itself. And you could literally cast anyone in those roles. I mean, the danger, I keep saying danger, it's not really a danger. The controversy would be, which happened with Hunger Games, right? With, like, if they had put a person of color in the role of Katniss, it would not necessarily have upended anything. The only thing it would have probably done is made that person a huger star. You know, because Jennifer Lawrence, I think by the time she got that, she was already, like, an Oscar nominee. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't necessarily launch her career, but
I feel like it launched it in the sense of, like, of
superstardom. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think she was already respected, and I'm not trying to take away from anything she's done, because she, you know, is amazing. But in terms of, like, tickets sold, you couldn't compare that to, what was the movie that she was nominated for?
The Winter's Bone?
Yeah, you can't compare that Hunger Games money to Winter's Bone. But even with Hunger Games, there was a character that people got upset about.
That she was black, right? Rue.
Yeah, she was black. Even though in the book, she was black. And people were like, oh, I didn't picture her that way.
Right. You know, but it goes back to the default whiteness we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Speaking of, like, superheroes, though, you got your own little superhero to play Lara in the adaptation. What was the casting for Lana Condor like? And I mentioned superhero because she was in X-Men. She's Jubilee, the iconic Asian American superhero for a lot of us growing up in the 90s. What was it like having Lana embody Lara Jean for you?
It was really wonderful. And I had my eye on her because after she got cast as Jubilee, I was excited because I was like, this could potentially be something. Because I was hoping that would be enough of a boon for casting directors or producers to see her as somebody who could helm a movie and be the lead. Right. And that's the thing. It's like getting those parts that aren't the lead, and then you kind of get your feet wet a bit, and then hopefully can keep going, you know, to have a career. And that's what I've said to Lana since we first met, was that I just want her to be able to keep going and to keep making movies and to get those chances.
She's probably had the most screen time as Jubilee in the 3 or 4 actors who've played her over the course of the X-Men franchise. And I remember her casting being really a big deal for a lot of us, because so many, we all love Jubilee.
Mm-hmm.
Like anyone who grew up in the mall in the 80s can identify with that character. Unfortunately, she didn't have that big a role in the movie. I think a lot of her scenes got cut. So it's great to see her kind of be able to launch, hopefully, a franchise of her own. And Netflix picked up the film, and it'll drop everywhere on
everywhere.
August 17th.
Worldwide, yeah. And they've been amazing, I have to say. Like, I'm very pro Netflix.
Kind of have to be, but I get it.
I don't have to be, but I just am. They're so great. And they and also Awesomeness, who produced the movie, have been really on board from the beginning. And so I should clarify that when I'm talking about producers who didn't really get it, those are people who I chose, like, not to work with.
Right.
Because it was, like I said, it was like a non-starter. But it definitely was a road to get here, even at the different places it's been seen, and like if people not really understanding that vision.
Were these negotiations happening during like that whole whitewashed out period? Because I feel like it's been only in the last couple years. And I'm not trying to say because we did this hashtag, but I feel like the conversation shifted definitely in 2016 when we had all of these controversies kind of back to back to back.
Oh, I think absolutely it's true. I think like Oscar So Whitewashed Out, all of that stuff, I think was putting a spotlight on stuff that people either didn't see or didn't want to see or, didn't really understand. It felt like my conversations were expanding so much between 2016 and 2014. Mm-hmm. It was a really different landscape. It just like it opened up in so many ways.
Because I think, prior to that conversation, maybe there wouldn't have been people who would be willing, like if you said no, it's a non-starter that you cast a non-Asian actress 5-10 years ago, they wouldn't. All right, then we're not going to adapt this book. Then you know what I mean? Like it feels like that was always the line, and that's something that I feel like we're slowly but surely kind of moving away from finally.
Yeah, and I think one of the game changers in a weird way is going to be that now that it seems like Hollywood's not making as many like small movies, it's mostly these big sort of tentpole movies. People are finding other ways to make them and then to distribute them. Where it's because
that's where something like Netflix kind of stepping in is a big deal.
Yeah, and it's also like young people don't go to the theater in the same way that previous generations did. Because people, like to watch it at home or like on their phones or whatever they're doing, and it is an opening for more kinds of stories. I think the sad part of it is that you're not getting as many of those stories told like on the big screen the same way, because there seems like less of those kind of like mid-budget movies.
Yeah, they almost don't exist anymore.
Yeah, because I get it. It's so expensive to go to the theater. Like I went and saw Game Night in the middle of the day because I was like had between like dinner and like a meeting, and it was $17. Like,
yeah.
Now $17 for Black Panther, I'm happy to pay that.
That's an experience.
And like, oh, you want to see it in the big screen, but like, and I really enjoyed Game Night too. I laughed a lot, but
was it worth $20?
$20 for like a teen? It's kind of a lot of money, and that doesn't include my popcorn and my drink. Right.
And the thing is, like, you could spend that same if you wait 2 months, you spend that same amount, and you can own it forever.
Yeah.
On iTunes, or even I guess teens don't buy like Blu-rays either. But like,
no, and I mean, remember it used to be you would wait like 6 months.
Yeah, or even 6 months feel like I remember waiting like a year for like Batman to come out on VHS.
Yeah, and then it was like so precious to you.
Yeah, oh for sure.
You had to see it in the theater, and there weren't those other options.
Yeah.
And I mean, I definitely miss that, but it's also like now I think in some ways it'll be helpful for people of color to get movies made for cheaper, and then that there's more avenues for people to see them.
It democratizes it.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we always do on Southern Fried Asian is have our guests think back to a food that brings them back to a time or place, because there's one thing that Southern people and Asian people have in common is a love for food. There's a reason we call this podcast Southern Fried Asian. So what is the one thing that takes you back to Richmond, even if you're like thousands of miles away?
The one thing I think of is chicken wings. And I grew up with my grandparents living in our household, and my grandmother used to make these barbecue chicken wings. And it was like a taste like I've never tasted again. Like my mom tries to make it and it doesn't taste as good. But it literally it was like the Casey Masterpiece barbecue sauce with like Korean pepper sauce, gochujang, and some sugar and like some soy sauce and some garlic and whatever else grandma was putting in that sauce. But then she would bake those wings and they would get sort of like blackened the tips. And I remember I just had my little bowl of rice and I had the wings and I would just like gobble them up.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, that's one of my earliest memories too, is like of my little sister eating those wings. And I remember I would be like, look over there. And she would like look over her shoulder and then I would pick her wings. So for me, I think chicken wings is it. And now as an adult too, my aunt owns a Korean restaurant in Richmond and she's famous for her wings.
You want to give it a quick plug?
Yeah. 88 Garden is 88 after when the Olympics were in Korea. It's called 88 Garden on Midlothian Turnpike.
Nice.
And she has the best wings you'll ever taste. And a lot of, like, there's similar wings being made these days, like the bonchon chicken.
Right.
But hers are really superlative.
Do they taste like your grandma's?
No, they're different. These are like a double-fried type of wing that's like sweet and spicy.
Right.
But people come from far and wide for those wings.
But there's still nowhere you can get grandma's old style wings.
No, grandma's old stuff. I gotta try it myself. Actually, I'm gonna ask my mom for that recipe.
I'm telling you, I bet it's the Casey barbecue sauce is probably what's the
probably MSG. MSG could be the secret ingredient. Gotta get some of that.
Well, that's a perfect thing too, because like talking about the intersections between being Southern and being Asian and Koreans especially, like I think you guys got the chicken wing game on lock, so I appreciate that. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for spending time with us on the podcast. Can you let our listeners know where they can find you online?
Yeah. Hi. I am on Instagram as Jenny Han. I'm also on Twitter as Jenny Han. And I have a website called Jenny Han.
It's really easy.
It's really easy. Yeah. And thank you so much.
No, thank you. And we're looking forward to All the Boys on Netflix August 17th. Is there another book or series that you're working on that you can hint about?
I'm working on it. Just working.
Gotcha. Understood. Well, keep working. Keep being a great voice for us, representing Virginia. Appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much, Keith.
My thanks to Jenny Han for joining us on Southern Fried Asian. Thank you out there for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Southern Asians and on Instagram at Southern Fried Asians. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at The Real Chow, _real_Chow, and follow the Nerds of Color at The Nerds of Color on Instagram and Twitter. Go to hardknockmedia.com/Southern Fried Asian to subscribe to our podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Play, the NPR One app. You can also find the other podcasts in the Hard Knock Network, including Ask Bi Girls, Desi Geek Girls, We're Not All Ninjas, DC TV Classics, and Hard Knock Life. As always, Southern Fried Asian is co-produced by Jess Vu. Go to patreon.com/The Nerds of Color to support all of the work that we do. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.